religious leaders. So they're choosing to reject him, and so they come to him to ask him a question to trap him. They determine that he has to die. Really early in this interaction with him, they determine that he has to die. So this theme of persecution, or this theme of the conflict that Jesus has between the religious leaders, or between himself and the religious leaders of the day, that's a reality in the Gospel of Mark up through where we are now. But it doesn't end. It continues, and ultimately it's going to end in his death, but that's God's plan anyway. Then one more I'll just mention before we get into Mark 9, which is kind of what's going on here, is that Jesus is dealing with the lack of faith of the apostles. There's the confronting of their lack of faith that seems to go on in many different ways, in many different segments of the text as we've worked our way through. And what Jesus is trying to do is build up the faith of the disciples. And we've highlighted several things that gave us insight into the lack of faith, where he would say something like, why do you have no faith? And they are afraid, and they are puzzled, and they have no real idea of who he is and why he's here. It seems that they're just confused and have no real understanding of who Jesus is. So what Mark is doing is showing us how Jesus is trying to give them insight into who he is. So if you remember, what's just happened before chapter 9, verse 14, is this mountaintop experience that Peter, James, and John had with Jesus. Jesus takes these three up on the mountaintop. Up on the mountain, I don't know if it was on top, but up on the mountain. And it is there that Jesus was transfigured. And then you had Elijah and you had Moses appear. And you have that really well-known response by Peter, which is, this is a good thing, let's build 3 tents. Let's build 3 places so we can worship. Jesus, the other 2 disappear. There's this voice from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." So the statement and everything that takes place there is an effort to instill in them who it is they're dealing with. Who is Jesus? Now, of course, Mark's writing this to help the reader, help us and his original readers, trying to help these readers see who Jesus is. Mark's introducing Jesus. That's simple. But it's a strain as Mark works his way through the writing of this, because just like the apostles, many of us struggle with being able to put it in our brains and to be able to flesh it out. When we get this picture of Jesus, what's the picture we get? I mentioned early on, when we're trying to communicate with somebody, it's vital that we understand the definition of the word we're using. Because if I say a word and your definition is completely different than mine, we'll never communicate. We just won't do it. So what we have here is when Peter says, in answer to Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" You're the Christ. Well, what did Peter mean by the Christ? He did not mean the Son of God, the Savior of the world, the one who died on the cross to save us from our sins, the one that God sent down from above to be able to die for the sins of the whole. He didn't mean that, did he? Because when Jesus says, "I got to die," Peter said, "No, you can't. No, that's not going to happen." And so the understanding of what Christ meant, of what the Old Testament Messiah would be like, was different for Peter than it is for us. Because we understand on this side of it. We're reading the Gospel of Mark from our perspective now, 2,000 years after the cross, 2,000 years after this interaction that the apostles are having with Jesus as they walk through this world in which these apostles have lived now for all these years, and their expectations and their knowledge and understanding of what the Messiah would be are not in harmony with what Jesus is trying to tell them the Messiah is. And so he's trying to give them enough information, trying to show them who he is so that they can come to that point of, oh, that's who he is. Now I get it. By the way, how long did it take them? Did they get it before he died? It says that they kind of got it after the resurrection. Kind of maybe got it after the resurrection. But I don't think they still did, because they run and hid. They locked themselves in a room. Do you grasp who this Christ is? Oh, yeah, I do. I don't think you do, because you're hiding. Yeah, some of them went back to fishing, exactly. So it's like everything that he had taught them hadn't sunk in yet. I'm going back and giving kind of introduction because I'm trying to remind myself that when I jump right here in the middle of Mark chapter 9, that Jesus is going to talk to them about this argument that they're having. Chapter 9, verse 16, what are you arguing about with them? So the argument is about their inability to, we'll read it. We'll read it. But here, let me just, one more thing, and then we'll jump into the text. And just recognize that the glory of the Christ is yet to be understood by these apostles. They still haven't grasped it. So what Jesus is doing is he's giving them more and more. He's just giving them more. So the illustrations are just rampant through the Gospels, and of course we're studying Mark specifically, so we're thinking about those educational experiences that he gives them in order to try to bring them into the know. And really this is connected to, in my opinion, it's connected to all the way back to chapter 8, and especially remember when the Pharisees demanded a sign. Jesus said, I'm not going to give you a sign because you are asking for something that I'm already giving you. You should already be able to see it. And he left them, got in a boat, and then he begins to teach the apostles about beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians. Beware of that. And he's got this loaf of bread, and their concern is, where's our next meal coming from? So they don't get it. They don't grasp what Jesus is all about, because they're more concerned about the physical than they are the spiritual. And so then he gives them some chastisement. Then he because he says, you have eyes to see and ears to hear, but you can't see, and you have ears to hear, but you don't hear. And then the next thing that he does is heal a blind man. I don't think that's an accident that Mark put that there, because he's illustrating that there are those like you who see partially. You don't see all the way. You don't have a clear vision of who I am yet. You just don't have that. So then he asks, who am I? Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? You're the Christ. Okay, let's talk about what that means. What that means is I'm going to die. Chapter 8, verse 31. Whoa, what? Okay, you say I'm the Christ. Let me tell you who the Christ is. The Christ is the one who will die. That's me. Chapter 8, verse 31. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, chief priests, scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And then Peter pulls him aside and chastises the Lord. You can't say that. And Jesus says, get behind me. You're not leading this crowd. You're not leading this group. You're not the voice. You're not the one who determines what is. You're not the one who determines who I am. I am. You can't determine that. It's already settled. I am the one. Then he talks about their sacrifice. What does it mean to be a disciple? It doesn't mean that you're going to get lots of good bread and fish when you follow him. It doesn't mean that you're going to get healed when you have a sickness. It doesn't mean that all things are going to be well with you. As a matter of fact, he says, if you come after me, you must deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. So what does it include? Suffering. Who's the Christ? The suffering. Who are you? What's going to happen to you? You're going to suffer. So another one of those themes that picks up early on in the Gospel of Mark is the suffering servant, the Christ. I will die. That's what he says. And then he also tries to tell them that if you're going to follow me, then there is going to be loss in the physical world. And if you lose in the physical world, you will gain. But if you know how it goes. That's at the end of chapter 8. So then he continues that, going into chapter 9 with this transfiguration. And now you have the disciples that were not on the mountain. And that's the setting of what takes place when you get chapter 9, verse 14. You have these others, not Peter, James, and John, who were on the mountain with Jesus, but the others. So we begin in chapter 9, verse 14. Now, I talked for a long time and said a lot of things. Let me just give you an opportunity to respond. Maybe there's something that's been sparked in your mind as some of the things I said. You might want to add to that or help us out with something. Any comments?
He depicts his death when he says, pick up the cross and follow me.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is the first time he uses the word cross. Because later on, they're going to figure out when he does put him on the cross, maybe that's what he was talking about.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. John points out the use of the word cross when he says, take up your cross and follow me, because he's going to do that later on. He will take up his cross.
The cross, that would be like me saying electric chair.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you think that confused them totally? Or what? How would have they taken that?
We have very little information on how that affected them, if it did at all, but it seems that up to this time, what he had talked about his death, other than Peter's response, but it seemed like it was like this.
That was to them at that time. That had to have been really strange for him to say that.
Yeah, you're right. Ryan's observation about how strange it would be for him to bring up the cross, because that would be it'd be a dirty word. Yeah. Mm-hmm. An oxymoron, isn't it?
You're supposed to be the king. You're going to conquer these guys, and they're going to put you on a cross. That doesn't make sense. That can't happen.
To me, it's almost as if they just dismiss that. It's like the incident in the boat when Jesus is trying to talk to them about beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the Herodians, and they say, what are we going to eat? It's like, they didn't get it. They weren't listening. They didn't hear it. They didn't grasp it. Jesus is trying to teach them, and they're concerned about what are we going to eat. We didn't bring any food. Okay, anything else?
Is that a price they pay?
Sure, yeah. Exactly. That's part of that whole statement there that he makes about the cost or the price of choosing to follow me. You got to make a choice. I'm not going to make you. I'm not going to force you. You make a choice, and if you do that, then there's going to be a cost to that decision. Okay, so the other 9 disciples are here in this scene. It's really a long reading, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. So we kind of get the gist of it as we understand in the first few verses about what's taking place. Because what happens is, beginning verse 14, when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed. There's that theme we were talking about, astonished or amazed. And they ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. He was often cast into fire, into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." Let me stop right there. Why could the apostles not cast out this demon? All right, that's exactly what Jesus is saying, isn't it? That the reason this didn't happen before I came down here is because those that were trying to do it didn't have the faith in me. So you see that same theme going, they just don't have it. They don't have what they need yet. So what happens then is Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit. He commanded him to come out and never enter him again, and it came out. This kind, he says, verse 29, is not driven out by anything but prayer. Now that's the end of the interaction. Jesus makes 2 statements at the end, actually 3 statements. How long has this been happening to him? If you can, because the man says, "If you can do anything, have compassion." And Jesus says, "If you can, all things are possible for the one who believes." And then the last statement he makes is, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." So if the apostles had faith, then they would have the faith to be able to pray to God, to be able for this to be performed as it needed to be performed. So I think, again, this story, this boy with the unclean spirit, is another testimony to the fact that the disciples, those apostles, these 9 that were left here, and they had this interaction with the scribes and this crowd, because the scribes are arguing and the crowd's gathered, and it seems they're kind of worked in kind of a frenzy, because as Jesus and James and Peter and John come down off the mountain, this is what they're greeted with. So the crowd rushes to Jesus, and they are glad to see him. They are amazed, and they are super glad to see him, and they greet him. And so Jesus gets the rundown on what's going on here. So again, I think this fits into this whole series of things that Mark has included in order to demonstrate the fact that the apostles do not yet have the kind of faith that they need in order to do what God's going to ask them to do. Yes?
Only by prayer. I think the apostles possibly have gotten to the point where, when you start doing miracles and all of a sudden, it's like, look what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Like they came back to Jesus one time when they were going out doing these things. Man, all I the devils are subject to us.
Yeah.
well, the devil's not subject to you, they're subject to God.
Exactly, yeah.
You know, like they began thinking they were doing these things. And here Jesus is saying, look, you forgot, it's not you doing this. You got to depend on God to do this. You got to depend on the Father. You can't do it yourself. And I think they were just thinking they could just do these things, and they forgot where their powers come from.
That may be a part of it as well. It very well could be. But he mentions the word faithless too. That points me in that. Yes.
They didn't have faith and they needed God's help.
That's right.
Exactly.
They didn't have faith in Him to do it, because they weren't even directed to them.
But
Faith in Him.
they don't ask for help. The father of the child asked, he says, help me in my unbelief.
Mm-hmm.
The disciples didn't ask that question. The father did. So maybe that's the reason why Jesus took pity on him and did heal him.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I read this, when I look at this story, I put it together with everything that's around it and what we've already talked about from chapter 8 all the way through here. And it seems to be another one of those stories that Mark puts here to demonstrate the fact that the disciples still didn't have it together. They still have the need to have more faith. They still have that need to realize and to understand who this rabbi is that they're following. Because remember, just before this, Peter addressed Jesus simply as rabbi. Teacher, come over here. You can't do that. So I think this is another one of those in this series that demonstrates the need for the growth of the disciples, the need that they have to be able to grow in faith. And I'll bolster that by pointing you to the next things that happen in the chapter, beginning in verse 30, where you have Jesus again proclaiming his death, burial, and resurrection. And then what's the next thing that happens? They are discussing who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. That's next. I mean, you can't cast out a demon because you're more concerned about who's going to be vice president or chief of staff than you are about doing the will of God. I rest my case. They don't get it. So look what he says. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching the disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They'll kill him, and when he is killed, after 3 days he'll rise again. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. You know what Jesus wanted right there? Ask me. Be curious. Give me opportunity to give you more information. But right now, you don't even care enough to just grab my arm and say, stop. Let's stop right here. Let's don't go any further until we get this settled. What kind of Messiah are you?
Because they come straight from Daniel. And that's what Jesus is before the Sanhedrin. He says, the Son of Man. And that's when they get all upset. And apparently they didn't pick up on that either.
Right.
That's the key to me, is that this is a little different from Christ. This is a little different from the Son of God. This is the Son of Man. This is who is going to be reigning again in heaven with God.
Mm-hmm.
The Son of Man.
Yeah.
I am the Son of Man. And they still didn't get it.
They didn't get it. They did not understand. So it says it very plainly. They did not understand. And then you have Mark inserting this story, which gives us understanding about their mindset. It gives us great understanding. Verse 33, they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12, and he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. So you've got this series of stories. I think there's no way that any of the Gospels, the way that the stories are in place, I don't think it's a mistake. I don't think it's happenstance. I think there's a reason. It's inspired by the Holy Spirit. And I think the theme runs very clearly through Mark, because what Jesus is trying to do is to bring them into more faith, more belief, to an understanding of who He is. And the reason is because of exactly what happens right here. He says, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, and after 3 days be raised. When they get to the house, Jesus says, what were you guys talking about? We're not going to tell you. Because what they were talking about was, who's going to be the greatest? Who's going to be the greatest? And Jesus then makes application. He takes that and he pulls out of that difficult moment. I can just see that if this is me, I'm pulling my hair like that and I'm going, I can't believe you don't get it. I just can't believe it. Jesus, evidently, with little disgust, says, if you'd be first, you must be last.
Hey, could you explain what you mean with that? Why would they be afraid? Why would it be a fearful thing for them?
Well, if the teacher asks, I'm not talking about in church necessarily, but if at school the teacher asks, who did what, and you answer and it's the wrong answer, you're going to be very embarrassed. So if the teacher's explaining something, and I didn't do this in algebra, and I almost flunked algebra. I don't understand. Would you tell me that? I don't understand. Because there's a stigma. If you raise your hand and you say, I don't understand. So nobody wanted, they're concerned. Put yourself in that situation, Randy, where they're already concerned about who's going to be the greatest. They're not going to wash the feet. Remember that? They're not going to do that. And they wouldn't dare raise their hand and say, Jesus, I don't understand. Would you explain that further? The rest of them are going to go, you don't know. Maybe that's it. I don't know. Because you're in this crowd, this 12, and you're already concerned about who's going to be the greatest. They're not going to wash each other's feet, because that's a lowly servant's responsibility. That would make me look bad. And so if I don't understand, that makes me look dumb.
Well, I guess it's right before that, that same statement you made, similar. Peter was rebuked about it, so it's, we already kind of got, rebuked for it. So I guess maybe that not have been a
I don't want to be rebuked like Peter was. He called him Satan.
In actuality, none of them stuff.
Right. Exactly.
Not make fun.
Mm-hmm. So the statement that Jesus makes immediately following this story about, hey, you guys didn't have the right ingredients to be able to pull this off, which was faith and prayer. Faith and prayer. And let me remind you that I'm going to die. And on the way to the house where they're going, they're still discussing about who's going to be the greatest. So the lack of understanding is highlighted, I think, in a great way, all the way up through this. Any other observations?
Cast this demon out. Why they didn't say, wait a minute, hey, Jesus is right up here. Let's go get him.
Mm-hmm.
Again,
Right.
it's kind of like a need of prayer where, we need to go get help from somebody who can do this.
Right.
so it's kind of weird, yeah.
I think, again, that goes back to their mindset, which was they didn't want to admit that they were not up to par, maybe. Because they're still concerned about the physical, remember? They're still all concerned because what Jesus condemned Peter about was your thinking is physical. You're thinking about you're with worldly mind. You're not thinking with a spiritual look on things. So they're still doing that. They did that in this inability to heal the boy with an unclean spirit. They're doing it as they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. It's still about that physical, earthly mindset, and that's what they're thinking with. And Jesus is trying to turn that channel, change the channel.
In principle, are we much different than those 12 disciples today?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I say we're looking at humanity at its best with the disciples. Are we any better? No, we are only advantaged because we have, I don't say only, but we are advantaged because we have these stories right here with us. And we're 2,000 years advanced and or past them, and
You gotta remember the culture of the time, the people of the time, the teaching of the time, what they believed in the time, at that time, not now.
right, exactly.
2,000 years
Yeah.
later.
Yeah, I think the Bible really gives us an insight into human nature, period. I think you're right. And we are as afraid of rejection. We're afraid of judgment, somebody judging us. We're afraid of being pointed out as being a failure or dumb or any of that. We're afraid of all of that. And hey, we've been chosen to follow a rabbi, a very good rabbi who can do miracles. I mean, he can do magic tricks. And I mean, I say that jokingly, but what did they think those were? Okay, we're all the way down to really verse 38. Our time is almost up. So let me just, he really highlights the difficulty that we see in verses 30 through 32, which is their lack of understanding by the disciples, the lack of understanding about who he really is, about what's going to happen. And then you have this, who's the greatest, the greatness, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom. The disciples are discussing that. Unfortunately, it's easy, as has been noted, to have disdain for these disciples and really give them a hard time, but we still have that difficulty as well. So let me just introduce what Jesus says in verse 38, beginning. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name. We tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because of you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward." So let's pick up there next week. So let me highlight what's happened here, because what happened at the end of that story about who's going to be the greatest, and Jesus says you have to become a servant. The one that's first must become last. You have to be a servant. He uses the illustration of a little child, and he pulls the child to him, and he uses this object lesson. And that object lesson is, you receive others as you would a child in my name, you receive me. And if you receive me, you receive the one who sent me. So he uses the child as an illustration of humility, of having that childlike ability to look at the world through different eyes, I think. And by the way, this story is not, it's not expanded on. It's not, he doesn't give us a whole long explanation about what's going on here, but he does in a way explain it by saying when you have that attitude or that outlook, when you understand how significant it is to be one who stoops, to be one who serves, to become last, then you finally are going to be able to understand who I am, and by receiving me, you'll receive the Father. So he kind of wraps it all up, doesn't he? In my opinion, he kind of wraps it all up. If you're looking at how to be great, become like a child, receive in that way, receive me, accept me, learn me, know me, and you'll receive the Father. All right, appreciate your comments. Our time is gone.